out blocks and blocks of control. We have things we call functions, procedures, subroutines. They're variously called different things in different languages. And really, honestly, these days, the only people that use the term subroutine are programmers of VB, Fortran, and Star Trek. Yeah, you'll see that they still, in the 23rd century, they've gone back to calling them subroutines. But that's because that franchise crystallizes the language of the 1960s. Okay, so they are using that. As an aside, don't let mathematicians say you're misusing the word functions. The word function means exactly what you think it means, and then there is a concept of a mathematical function. That's a specific type. They don't get to own that word. This one was around for a lot longer. Okay, I'm just going to point of clarification there. So here's an observation from Donald Knuth. Subroutines are special cases of more general program components called coroutines. In contrast to the unsymmetric relationship between a main routine and a subroutine, there is complete symmetry between coroutines, which call on each other. And here's a thought. What he's saying is this is a general approach. And actually, there was a lot of discussion about this up until about the end of the 80s. And around the end of the 80s, this whole idea of coroutines started going away. And cooperative multitasking was pretty much gone as a kind of default way of doing stuff on certain classes of system by the mid-90s. Only Apple were kind of clinging onto it dearly for a few things and then decided to reintroduce it with iOS. Every time somebody does that, they eventually end up with a preemptive system. But what was interesting is coroutines disappeared off the map as a language construct. And Knuth highlights the fact that the person that invented them was Melvin Conway. And if you're familiar with Conway's law, yeah, it's the same Conway. Melvin Conway invented coroutines in 1958. Here is an early 60s paper where he talks about how this can help you write a compiler. The reason I highlight this important point about history is that coroutines are actually older than, that means the else and while statements. They are one of the oldest sequential and procedural constructs that we have available to us. I say that because a lot of languages have been getting in on the act recently, and I've even seen blogs where someone said, there's this new idea. It's 1950s fresh, okay? Coroutines are subroutines all at the same level, each acting as if it were the master program, when in fact there is no master program. The coroutine notion can greatly simplify the conception of a program when its modules do not communicate with each other synchronously. This idea was prevalent and was in people's heads. So Clue, very influential language, was actually used as a teaching language up until the 1980s at MIT. Barbara Liskov, if you've come across Liskov's substitution principle, yep, that's her. And she won the Turing Award in 2008. So these are fairly high-profile individuals. Now, what is interesting here is that in Clue, we find a language with a lot of the concepts that are familiar to us. We have the terminating, the block-structured termination model of exceptions that we are familiar with now. This is where it comes from. Okay, it's this language. There's a bunch of stuff here. The idea of having iterators. Her observation is that iterators are a form of coroutine, not the iterators that are separated out into separate entities that we find in C++, but a routine that runs in parallel effectively with the thing that wants something from a loop. So they are effectively concurrent. And so they were present in the language. Okay, she introduced them in that, her and her grad students, that's the folks on the rest of the folks on the list. However, their use is sufficiently constrained, they are just implemented using the program stack. That's an important observation because their use doesn't require, a coroutine requires a separate stack, but she recognized, yeah, effectively, these run concurrently, but in practice, their use is so constrained we can get away with it. And so here is some Clue, and there's some really nice things in here to note. Just for those of you who care about language history, well, you must do. You're in here. So we've got the yield keyword. Okay, it's 1973, 1974 we're looking at here, just to give you a sense of how new this idea is. We've got multiple assignment. We've got optional commas. Optional semicolons. I didn't learn about that until relatively recently, actually, because all the early papers include semicolons. It turns out you didn't need them. So there's a whole load of stuff here. You've got declare anywhere. That's actually Algol 68. That's not clue. But there's something here that's really quite interesting. If you program in Python, then yeah, all of these features are there. In C#, this is an interesting thing for me with C#, because when C# introduced iterator methods, I remember, so this was around 2005, C# 2, if I remember correctly. I remember thinking, oh, they've introduced yield keyword, and they've introduced these. I said, oh, that's at least a foot in the door of coroutines. I wonder if they're going to go all the way. The answer to that question was no. Disappointingly not. They made the same observation that Barbara Liskov did. It's just like, sufficiently constrained, we can kind of get away with using the regular stack and a couple of continuation points. And then we have C++ here, where we have to do a little bit more faking to get some of the effects, but no, it still kind of works. And of course, you can only do that officially since a couple of years ago. The std generator, I mean, the way that C++ came along, C++'s history is, hey, we're going to introduce a thing in the language, and nobody anywhere in the library is going to use it. That's a philosophy of the C++ standard. I know there are some standards people in this room. I am mocking you. We're going to introduce a feature, and we're not going to use it. That's how good it is. What? No, we're going to wait and see how no, that doesn't work. Nobody else does that. Look at every other language. So until 2023, you couldn't really do anything useful and convenient. You could do useful things, which were, pet projects, and do lots of talks about them. They're really good for talks because nobody understands them, because basically it's the IKEA approach without the instructions. But fortunately, we can just put that on the end now, and it's just as easy as it was in other languages. But here's an important idea. For all of my mockery, there's the whole point here. This is really important because C++ is actually reclaiming part of its origin story. Part of its origin story is way back in the day. As Biana recounts in Design Evolution, which is a truly wonderful book. I wish more people involved in language design would write these things, because it really gives a very deep rationale. But he said the first real code to be written in C with classes, as was called then, was the task library. So task.h was available on a number of platforms till the end of the 1980s. And it was really only in the 1990s it started disappearing or becoming non-standard. It was never standardized. And Biana's background, Biana had learnt Simula, the kind of original object-oriented language, Simula 67, and had worked and had learned Algol and then learned C. And when you realize that, you start realizing an awful lot about the influences on the language. But this was really an important one. As far as he was concerned, this was kind of the reason he needed this kind of simple concurrency model. But what is interesting is this actually predates the concept of objects. People often talk about Simula 67. In 1965, the first version of Simula, excitingly called Simula 1, actually did not have what we consider to be objects. It had the process model, which was a coroutine model. Simula 1, a process was a bunch of data attributes associated with a single action known as the process's operating rule. Each process's operating rule could be suspended or resumed at any time. Basically, they were a coroutine. In fact, most reports are not as hesitant as this one. They were a form of coroutine. So this is kind of an interesting so in other words, C++ has reclaimed territory that it had at the beginning of its life and then kind of lost out for most of its history. So let's go back to one of these things. And this is something there's a